I'm very happy to be here and to meet you, Ostias. So to give you a small introduction, my name is Isabel Lewis. I'm an artist based in Berlin. Mis raíces son dominicanos, pero fui criada en Estados Unidos. I lived in Florida for many years and in New York, where I began, where I was working as a professional dancer and a professional choreographer. I trained actually in classical ballet, then entering into contemporary dance and modern dance. And over time, started making works in theaters. And after many years of making works in theaters, I felt that I needed to create a new ground, a space where I felt I could create the kind of live art and performance that suited my sensibility, something that had to do less with the event and the spectacle of performance and something more with a range of possibilities in terms of the kind of range of presence inside of performance and actually implicating the body and the presence of the visitor inside of the work. So I started creating what I call hosted occasions. Two of which I hosted here in Buenos Aires for the first time presenting my work here, and I was very moved and very touched and very grateful for the generosity of the audience and the incredible work of the entire team of Faena who really made it happen. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and allow you to introduce yourself.
Gracias. Mi nombre es Yanov. Trabajo y vivo acá en Argentina. También mis proyectos están encarados alrededor de lo performático o de lo escénico o de la combinación de ciertas temáticas sociales que pueden ser generadas o transmitidas a través del cuerpo. En esta disciplina, o sea, podría pensar como que mi escuela fue más bien una instancia grupal con un grupo que se llama Rosa Chancho. En ese grupo generamos cierto tipo de escenas performáticas o donde el público podía atravesar situaciones muy específicas y creo que a partir de ese devenir continué con la idea de cómo se generan ciertos tipos de grupalidades o cómo nos movemos en grupo. Últimamente, como mis trabajos intentan como combinar ciertas instancias más bien dentro de lo simbólico, si me pongo un poco más estricto dentro de ciertas políticas queer o del feminismo, reviéndolas y tratando de que no sea solo dentro de una percepción de la moda, que muchas veces ese tipo de filosofías aparecen y desaparecen como si fueran modas en la agenda del arte y sin embargo como que es interesante poder repensarlas y sostenerlas. Y bueno, más o menos por ahí.
Maybe I'll pick up on what you were saying about finding a format in which the audience could have a direct effect on the work so that the work became receptive to the public, the presence of the public and their way of being in the space. This is something I completely relate to, and I think this was my frustration with theater and creating works in theater for many years, was that I felt that the work, of course, was unfolding in the live, but it wasn't alive in the sense that it wasn't responsive or reactive. So for many years, almost 10 years, I made works that way that were sort of contained within themselves. They were kind of autonomous as artworks, and I could present them on a stage, and that could be moved around from place to place and reset in different places. And I found that stifling somehow, and also there was something that didn't feel contemporary for me about that expression. I was because of my kind of interest in an interest that I see that we share in sort of in queer theory, feminist philosophy, feminist theory. I felt that there was a kind of a necessity to explore a non-autonomous form of creating art or creating performance, something that could be porous, something that could be receptive and open and actually responsive. So for me, there's a real difference between live and kind of alive art, I would say. So the occasion format what I call the occasion, is something that I developed to be able to respond first and foremost to the site, the location. Every city in which I would travel to, I would do an open call castings for local performers and dancers, as I did here in Buenos Aires, and worked with 9 local performers. And this way of kind of creating a relation with the place that comes through the humans that you engage with, as well as with the materials that you engage with in each place, and the particular setting or the architecture. So I felt that was kind of, from responding to that, I could then bring with me the content of my work, and I almost think of it in a similar way to DJing, to the way that I think of DJing, which is, okay, I know this content, I have the material, it's based, it's around stories, it's around theory, it's around political ideas, and I unfold them in the situation in response to what's happening actually situationally with the public. So I don't predetermine, let's say, the course of a performance, but I know exactly what content I have to work with. And then I leave myself a certain amount of openness and ability to react and respond, and also generate something new each time. I'm not sure, is that something that you relate to? I'm curious when you say, how could you have, like, finding ways that you could have the audience have an effect on the situation? What are the ways that you deal with that?
No, estaba pensando, me quedé con una instancia específica de cuando uno trabaja con cierto tipo de teorías o también cierto tipo de corporalidades en un lugar y va a hacer ese trabajo a otro país. Que esto que vos hablabas en cuanto a trabajar con intérpretes que sean del mismo lugar donde estás haciendo el trabajo, que quizás no solo tiene que ver con cambiar de país, sino que puede ser como cambiar hasta de barrio dentro de una misma ciudad, que ya cada uno de los barrios pueden tener su sensibilidad. Y muchas veces pienso que la receptividad del público tiene también que ver con las corporalidades y con ese sentirse cercano a quien está desarrollando la interpretación de una obra, que en ese caso termina siendo una construcción de ambas partes, ¿no? de quien propone como, digamos, coreógrafo o artista o de ese proyecto, y quien le está interpretando. Entonces creo que muchas veces uno con quien menos contacto tiene es con el público, sino con quien más contacto tiene en ciertos trabajos de movimiento es con quienes van a interpretar esos movimientos, y por ende creo que a través de ese lugar vuelve la instancia de con quién uno se conecta a nivel público. Un poco pensaba eso. ¿Querés que hablemos de esta imagen?
Sí.
Oh. No, yo como que nos habían propuesto si queríamos traer algún tipo de trabajo, imagen para hablar e introducir, y creo que en los intercambios de correos que tuvimos había como ciertas temáticas que teníamos en común en esos trabajos, y nos parecía que esta imagen resumía o podía ser un buen, no sé si resumía, pero podía ser un buen disparador para esta charla alrededor de la posibilidad de nuevas corporalidades, ¿no? Acá hay como el descubrimiento de una sirena que le fue desenterrada por unos antropólogos y arqueólogos, y luego como que se la intentó definir por sus partes, ¿no? Esto no sabemos si es verdad o ficción, pero sí creo que muchos de nuestros trabajos están justamente en ese lugar en donde creamos una ficción para que esta realidad esté más cercana a esa posibilidad de nuevas corporalidades, de nuevos tipos de sociabilidad, donde claramente, volviendo a estas teorías, como que se eliminen ciertas teorías binarias de género, o se o se repiense cómo todo el tiempo sin querer estamos colonizándonos con ideas que no son tan propias. Y esta instancia de este nuevo cuerpo siempre, o como si viera un extraterrestre, siempre pareciera como que es una nueva posibilidad. Y creo que en ambos trabajos estamos como buscando esas ficciones para que incidan en la realidad.
Yeah, this is very strong for me, many of the words that you bring up here, and things like fiction also, that in my background, I studied literary criticism, and I felt that I was a big fan of fiction. I don't read as much fiction now, I read more theory, but nonetheless, the strategies of fiction, the way of proposing something, especially science fiction, Octavia Butler and many more, is a way of like proposing something into the world and thereby kind of actually bringing it into reality and like to manifest those alternatives. I think is something that I try to propose in my work, not only, and I think that this is also something that we share, not only to kind of deconstruct and criticize the certain, let's say the kind of hegemony of knowledge, of thought, of ways of being, of the West, the supposed myth of the West. Mm-hmm. I feel that both of us take a quite critical stance in relation to what that culturally represents. But our works seem to be interested in not only criticizing but proposing alternatives, mm-hmm. And ways of thinking about being, presence, sociability, that start first and foremost somehow with an encounter with one's own body, and what that can be. That actually can be a huge space of possibility. That the idea of a whole or a kind of neutral or a natural body has nothing to do. Like, we are cyborgs. We've been cyborgs. We've always been cyborgs, in the sense that the body and how we relate to tool use, the way that kind of Donna Haraway talks about this, I really like. It's like we've always been determining our design through the use of tools in our relation to the world, to nature, to whatever those ideas are. And so this thing of kind of locating the possibilities for experimentation and alternatives within one's own corporal reality is, I think, something that we really share. And this image, for me, the idea of monstrosity is so powerful, because in a way, what is a monster other than like the other? It's the ultimate other. Mm-hmm. I find it interesting too that if you look at the history of monsters in science fiction or in fiction and film, there's always something about a body which is not whole, which is not fully integrated. If you think of Frankenstein, mm-hmm. or you think of all of these kind of part machine, part human, or part animal, part human, it's somehow something hybrid or something that's not whole. It's somehow distributed in a strange way and kind of a mashup of things that shouldn't belong together somehow. Mm-hmm. And I think that's ultimately otherness, really, and then to explore that as a space of potential empowerment, I think is something I'm really interested in, these kind of in-betweens, in the spaces where we cannot apply a holistic logic. And I think that is the case inside of what I seek to create inside of the work. It's a format which maybe is between theater and between installation, between art, but I always find myself in between in every level of my life. And maybe you relate to this too, like whether it's in like my sexuality, whether it's my race, my identity, all of these things. I really consider myself inhabiting a space of always in-betweenness, and I actually find a great potential and a great agency inside of that space of being not clearly definable.
Estaba pensando que quizás estamos dando por hecho ciertas instancias de la práctica performática en sí misma, que quizás podríamos comentar hacia afuera, como ¿qué nos pasa? O sea, porque era un poco también la temática, ¿no? Como ¿qué nos pasa hacia afuera con la emergencia a nivel de idea de como que emerge esta práctica y se pone también de nuevo tan en agenda, porque está como esta solicitud de los cuerpos dentro del universo del arte. Acá en la feria en sí mismo pasa que como que a lo que más promoción se le ha dado es esta instancia performática, como si fuera algo sí, novedoso, pero como que vuelve también. ¿Qué significa esta vuelta, si se quiere, a la instancia performática? ¿Con qué podríamos nosotros pensar que está relacionada o con qué el público podría pensar que está relacionada? Yo como me lo pregunto y ahora y doy una respuesta, una pequeña hipótesis para que también lo comentes tu punto de vista. Como que yo en lo particular sentía que la instancia performática que como que pareciera en el escenario local expandirse tanto, en un momento sentí que justamente se había conceptualizado muchos términos y ahora era necesario como poner el cuerpo para que eso funcionara mejor. Después pensé en otra instancia que había una necesidad de tridimensionalización de los conceptos, como que necesitaban salir de ciertas estructuras o empezar a moverse, y el cuerpo era el que le podía dar esa instancia. Y ahora tengo como más dudas de a qué se refiere esta instancia medio del boom performático en ciertas escenas, como que en algunos momentos tengo como un cierto miedo de la espectacularización, de una necesidad de espectáculo que cierta instancia, entre muchas comillas, tradicional del arte no logra. Entonces, que la performance termina de como que poner en movimiento una instancia más espectacular, con las problemáticas que eso podría llegar a traer. Pero ahora tengo como, en este momento tengo dudas de qué es lo performático, a qué se refiere, qué es lo que estamos haciendo, por qué es esta necesidad de poner el cuerpo tan fuertemente ahora en el 2019.
Sí, tengo una pregunta, porque el tema de poner el cuerpo como que también es una expresión que viene un poco de las militantes. Yo mismo estaba pensando en esa expresión, como tratando de contestar esta cuestión de por qué, o sea, no al boom, sino como a la vuelta, ¿no? De la performance, como de los 60 ahora.
Sí.
Como para vos, ¿qué entendés por esa cuestión de poner el cuerpo? Como que sería poner el cuerpo. Más que nada porque es como esa frase hecha que también viene mucho de las militancias y de las militancias feministas.
Sí, estoy pensando, como que hay ¿no? se me tangencializa la respuesta, pero el otro día fui a la marcha del 24 de marzo, que es alrededor de la rememoración del golpe de Estado en Argentina, y estaban las banderas del siluetazo, como las siluetas. Y era como todo un grupo que mostraba las siluetas, que eran un tipo de manifestación donde la gente se ponía haciendo instancia de la idea de los desaparecidos. Entonces, la silueta por el desaparecido. Como había cuerpos que llevaban estandartes de siluetas de cuerpos que no estaban más. Como que quizás, y me sale sentir como una instancia como si hubiera algo de ausencia, de algo que no sé definirlo, y por eso hay que poner el cuerpo. Como que ante una ausencia quizás de grupo, de Estado, de nación, de desconstrucción contemporánea de esos términos, del patriarcado, de familia, que ya no se sabe muy bien qué es, que están indefinidos los límites. El cuerpo es un límite, es un lugar donde uno puede ver su silueta. Siento como que hay algo de esa instancia que podría ser, por eso se pone el cuerpo, porque es el último de los espacios definibles, como que el cuerpo es definible.
So many things to respond to there. I mean, I think that I also have my...
Creo que ahora voy a tener que...
Yeah, I also have my certain doubts about why the boom, as you were saying, why this kind of new, what seems like a new boom, but of course we've been here before, and performance has been a part of the kind of canon of art history before, and I think it's complex. I think it's multiple. I think there's a cynical way of reading it that maybe has to do with, that's maybe more connected to a shift in our economic realities, the shift from an industrial society to a service and experience-based form of economy. So I think that you know, I think that performance becomes also part of that. But there's no reason that we can't claim that space as a space of potential and not let it only be absorbed by sort of corporate interests or interests related to generating and acquiring wealth and income. I think that there's a craving for experience and embodied forms of experience, and I think that also has to do with perhaps the way that we're, as a culture, the way that we are developing in relation to the internet and to our technologies. There's almost a different forms. We require new forms of sociability and of socializing. The internet radically, obviously, created several new forms of sociability that allow us to connect over great, huge distances. And so I think there is a certain longing as well for contact, I sense. I think that the sense of kind of the individualism and the belief in individualism in our culture has also led us towards isolation. I think there's loneliness. So I think this question of gathering becomes not only personally, emotionally somehow important, but also very political. I think assembly, to kind of become a body and to become visible as a body, I think seems to be also very important right now, where you have different marginalized groups really trying to be seen, be acknowledged, and by being seen, thereby becoming having more agency and more power. There's something that I also have a certain criticality towards our obsession with visibility. Like, might we encounter or find a strength and a political strength in invisibility, actually. And I'm certainly not saying that for marginalized groups should not, that I certainly don't criticize that need. I think there is a necessity to be seen, and that is the economy of the moment that we're living in, that to be seen, to be acknowledged is to be powerful, and to be invisible is clearly to have no agency. However, I actually think there's something there. We shouldn't believe, I don't know, for me as an artist, I feel that, okay, I have a kind of privileged position to be able to imagine and work on alternatives to the kind of hegemonic modes or means of becoming relevant, powerful, seen. So I don't know, many different things that I wanted to say, but maybe I'll also was thinking about embodied forms of knowledge. I think my choice for always working with the body is not because of a kind of belief in the body. I think it's a very abstract concept. I don't think that the body is a whole concept. It's an assemblage of bacteria, fungi, chemical processes, technologies. It's a completely, like, where my body ends and yours begins is like completely blurry at a certain point. So it's not I don't have a lot of times with dance, there's this idea of the kind of romantic notion of the body and like the expression of liberty or freedom. I don't think that's how I see it. I see it as a very political site to work in. I see it as a very problematic place to work in, where you are thrown into really encountering the ways in which you are yourself formed by the culture that you have grown up in. And you're required to kind of, well, you can choose to reflect upon that, and if you do, you're confronted with a lot, and then how you deal with that becomes an important part of your process. It's not, I use the body because that's my medium. It's like I work with the body because I'm sorting through all of that complexity and recognizing the ways in which let's say that recognizing the deep-seated fears and anxieties that kind of Western culture bears in relation to the notion of the body. And I think there's a huge necessity. I think a lot of neuroses in a way comes out of those weird moves, weird repressions and misunderstandings about the body. One other tangent, and I'm like, wait, yeah, maybe we can bring it back. Maybe is there another question that can maybe bring us back to?
What's Western culture mean? It's a genuine question because I have no idea what it means anymore. Western culture.
Yeah, great question. I also don't know.
Sorry, I don't listen to what you say.
All right. He said, he was saying, what is the West? Yeah, what is the West? I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, what does the West mean now? Great question. I think that it's that I also have no idea what it means right now. It feels like all the things that formed that idea, the myth of the West, all those things that seemed at one point, maybe in another century, to be kind of liberal and democratizing, seem to be really threatening our ways of being on this planet in relation to ecologically speaking. So I think that we have a desperate need to find what are the ways that we're going to respond to the different crises that we find ourselves in ecologically and politically. So for me, I think when I refer to the West, or the myth of the West, I refer to a certain kind of union between a scientific worldview, capitalism, and Puritan ideals, that kind of, those three things that kind of merged and formed the culture that our kind of political structures or bureaucratic structures are all kind of founded in. So even if we're somewhere else, like this, if we're not even anymore in modernity, we're way beyond it, there's almost like we're still living out this hangover of it, because all of the ways that our, the structures by which we live, all of these processes are still inside of those logics. And this is why we really require, I think, creative energy inside of political systems, institutional structures, because we need to reform the way we think about institutionalizing, about how we think about gathering. What does it mean? What does education mean now? What does to become an institution mean now? What does it mean to be a political body now? It's a super amazing ripe time for asking all of those questions, interrogating them, and actually trying to form new proposals for them. Because, like you said, what is it? It's to me, for me, the 20th century kind of really shows a certain concretizing of this notion of the West. But it's 2019, and things are in a completely another state, and we have to, on the structural levels, bring some new thought, new life, new ways of doing and being into it. Yes.
There's a way to sell a homogeneous vision that doesn't exist.
So that it's a way to sell a homogeneous vision that doesn't exist. You mean to use the terminology, the West. Mm-hmm.
Acabo de terminar de pensar sobre un poquito lo anterior, como esta instancia de cuál es el límite del cuerpo, que si no sabemos somos un conjunto bacteriológico, realmente cuánto nos influencia en nuestro andar, siquiera el otro que está al lado.
Incluso los objetos, y quizás es una linda pregunta, como saber para cada uno dónde termina el cuerpo, qué significa, si bien antes hablábamos como del límite del cuerpo, ¿cómo sería, cuál es el no límite, cuál es ese espacio que lo va modificando? O vos hablabas en esta instancia de, podemos ser un conjunto de bacterias, órganos que también tienen su autonomía y su manera de, como seguramente nuestro estómago piensa muy distinto a nuestros pies. ¿Y cómo es que eso, por qué nos definiríamos, cómo hacemos para definirnos en esa instancia más líquida, digamos?
Yeah, I think that liquidity, complexity, maybe those are the characteristics, in fact, of, we use these kind of monolithic labels for things in order to be able to apply our systems of logic and reason to them and deconstruct them in particular ways. I think for now it's kind of it seems to be a form, the particular form of interacting, and a particular form of being educated in a particular way, which requires, right, these definitions which seem to have a certain amount of solidity, but when in fact perhaps the nature of things is, as you say, a bit more, is actually more liquid and more ambiguous and not integrated, not defined, and not ever homogeneous, actually.
Abrimos un poco a preguntas, ¿querés?
Yeah, sure.
¿Alguien quiere hacer como alguna? Yes.
Cuando vos te referís a esa experiencia corporal, vos recién decías que había como una necesidad de volver a experimentar con el cuerpo. Me gustaría saber, o sea, yo tengo mi propia visión y mi propia sensación de lo que es eso, pero me gustaría saber cuál es la tuya.
Yeah, I think for me the experimentation with the body begins with a bit the rehabilitation of all of the senses. I think that I sense that in the culture that I've grown up in, and that I was educated, there's a huge amount of importance given to vision, to seeing, to the act of sight itself, and using sight to be able to form objective distance, a critical distance, to be able to kind of judge and criticize things. So this seems like a habit of one way of activating the body. So for my own research and investigation, and then the place from which I depart in terms of transmitting that in my work, is actually trying to encounter again the other senses and perhaps train them, awaken them, in order to maybe create some kind of balance, some sense of balance. Because it seems to me that everything around me in the culture that I live in seems to suggest that the eyes and that vision and that this particular way of interacting with the world it has a kind of hierarchical relationship, maybe sound, or maybe seeing at the top, and then followed by sound, then maybe smell, and maybe taste. And I'd like to try to rearrange that structure a bit and believe, let's say, not to have as much faith. I don't have much faith in that seeing equals understanding something, or that by seeing it that it's true or that it's real. I think we know that more than ever somehow, and nonetheless our culture is very kind of stuck on vision. So for me that experimentation begins with actually trying to open up the senses and generating kind of more heightened awareness of myself in any given situation.
Me preguntaba también cómo experimentar con el cuerpo, también me preguntaba cómo experimentar con qué tipos de cuerpos, ¿no? Como que uno habla de la experimentación con los cuerpos y como en esta instancia claramente que no todos los cuerpos son iguales cuando uno trabaja con intérpretes, como esos intérpretes tienen una experimentación muy particular alrededor de su biografía y cómo llegan a esa instancia de baile, y creo que ese tipo de comunicación, cuando uno ve cómo experimenta el movimiento otra persona, asimila un poco de esa sensación y comparte información en esa experiencia. ¿Alguna pregunta general?
Donde tenés como un grupo de personas con las que trabajás, y como eso también hablaba de este tema del afecto, como hay algo de la relación entre los cuerpos que tiene que ver con el afecto, en el sentido de ser afectado. ¿Cómo se te estructura, cómo se te arma eso a vos? O sea, si vos a través de eso sentís que estás poniendo el cuerpo, como a través del cuerpo de los otros, o no sé, como que surge ahí con hacer este tipo de obra, con obra performática, pero vos estás como en otro modo.
Quizás podría hablar de una metodología de trabajo que cuando... Una metodología de trabajo claramente constante es... me enamoran más los movimientos de personas que no han profesionalizado su cuerpo en la danza, con lo cual tienen un poquito menos de academia, y eso a mí me enamora un poco más, a ir por los clubes nocturnos o ciertos grupos específicos de gente que ha transitado su corporalidad, bien por, no sé, porque hizo alguna transición de género, o bien porque salieron de las drogas, y entonces como en esa instancia de experiencia vivida con el propio cuerpo, la metodología muchas veces de los trabajos es, quizás sí hay una idea clara, pero casi que no, en lo particular casi que no hablo en los ensayos, como que las cosas van surgiendo, las expresiones corporales van surgiendo, las relaciones entre quienes están generando el proyecto van surgiendo, y quizás es una sensación, quizás eso es lo que afecta, es como decir un ahí, es decir, ahí. Y ese ahí, quizás es ese afecto o esa simpatía que uno entiende, que a veces yo lo llamo como rareza, como que veo esa rareza, que esa rareza es ese in-between que siento que un poco hablaba ella, como, esto es lo extraño, acá me siento cómodo, acá quizás todos nos sentimos cómodos. Y ese ahí a veces es bastante grupal cuando el método funciona. De nuevo, el método de afección es no hablar, mirar y como casi decir, ahí, como algo sucede ahí.
Yeah, I think it's also, as you were saying, different methodologies of working with performers and as a director or choreographer in relation to other bodies. I think you have certain practices in which an action is requested, and then that performer kind of executes this particular action for whatever thematic, conceptual reason. But then I have a sense that there's also another thing that I felt maybe was a bit shared without knowing your work too deeply, was that an interest in sociability, that it's not so much that I'm looking for a particular execution of a particular task or choreography as much as I'm interested in bringing a group together to have a process together and create an alternative form of sociability that we then make available to the public. So I'm not actually after a particular aesthetic ideal or an aesthetic. Yes, I do have very clear directions about the kinds of, let's say, movement, material. These things do have aesthetics and ethics wrapped up in them. But I think my interest in working with other bodies and directing other bodies has much more to do with forming this sociability and then sharing that with the public, rather than kind of be movement created for the display for others to consume.
Como me preguntabas ese tipo de sociabilidad que intentas generar en esa situación, podría ser una sociabilidad posible en el mundo exterior. O sea, es como que si algo de esa estructura, digamos, algo de ese mapa, algo de ese script, podría reproducirse fuera de una instancia escénica, si se quiere. Si podrías escribir una constitución alrededor de esa sociabilidad que se arma. ¿Qué es esa sociabilidad que se arma? ¿O que te gustaría que se arme?
I think I'm working on that. Let's say something that there's something that I've started working on since over a year now, what I call the Institute for Embodied Creative Practices. Mm-hmm. And this institute doesn't have a defined place. It doesn't have a defined group of people people. I'm the initiator of it. When I gather, it's a kind of way of gathering people around experimentation with different modes of embodiment. So a lot of it has to do with actually coming together to do a workshop about like strobe light and the hallucinations you have behind closed eyes, or a tasting session of pickling techniques, different modes of physicality. One Berlin-based artist, Maka, who combines the practice of yoga with perrear, with like reggaeton music, like a certain kind of booty shaking dancing with yoga. So for me, what I call the Institute for Embodied Creative Practices, it's a kind of a way of holding space for these kinds of encounters, so gathering together to engage the body in alternative ways. So I think this is kind of one kind of small-scale way in which I'm trying to move it. I'm curious in kind of allowing it to expand, let's say beyond the particularly artistic context, and becoming more of a social context, where nonetheless we use creativity as a way to kind of experiment with that sociability. And I do think that these things, I guess this is why embodiment for me is so radical. Like you engage with the process that is housed in your body and you move with that into the world. I guess I feel that way too in terms of even if I'm in an artistic context, the moment I show something and make it available to the public, it will find its way, it enters into the body of the public as well, and that moves out into the world. So I think I'm very interested in experimenting with that on various scales. So I guess that the next scale, when I see it, is what I call the Institute for Embodied Creative Practices, and then from there, I don't know. I feel like I'm interested in continuing to imagine ways that could become more expansive. How about for you? It's a great question. Like, it's a really interesting question.
No, como que de nuevo, en un momento nombrabas esta situación del el cuerpo luego cómo se mueve hacia el mundo de afuera, ¿no? Ese problema como que no entender que nuestra práctica también es ese afuera, ¿no? Como que o es parte de eso. Y me preguntaba como esas ganas, pero también esa fuerza de generar una institución, o sea, un instituto para estar más, para estar más afuera, o sea, para trabajar un poco más con ese afuera. A nivel personal, como la instancia institutiva se vuelve como tan burocrática, o sea, las experiencias institucionales se vuelven experiencias burocráticas. Esa es quizás es un problema local, ¿no? Como que todo lo institucional lo veo como un problema, incluso para lo corporal. Y de nuevo, pensaba, es un deseo como que una obra influya luego a nivel, que no haya ese adentro y afuera del trabajo, que no haya la obra y el mundo de afuera, sino cómo es ese momento en el cual se expande ese límite y que no haya necesidad de institucionalizar ese adentro, como que ese adentro es el afuera que queremos. Como si fueran unos vasos comunicantes de unos líquidos que pareciera que nunca se pueden terminar de mezclar. Y sin embargo estamos todo el tiempo haciendo lo de adentro, pensando en cómo sociabilizar hacia afuera. Me había quedado como con esa instancia. Y en lo particular, en los trabajos que voy realizando, como me parecerían, quizás esto es más personal, pero cuando veo que lo grupal podría llegar a funcionar como un sistema social quizás por la aceptación de los mismos integrantes e intérpretes que participan, que son quizás como de sensibilidades muy distintas. Quizás eso ya siento que es una manera social, como el compartir sensibilidades y que todos acepten sus diferencias. Y creo que, de nuevo, la experiencia corporal es mucho más amigable que la intelectual para llegar a esas instancias. Estoy yendo mucho a un campo nudista en donde la gente es muy de derecha. En este campo nudista la gente es muy antiabortista, supongamos, pero cuando están desnudos son todos amigos, digamos. Como que ¿qué pasa ahí? ¿Por qué ese cambio? Como ¿por qué en esas como pequeñas utopías todo está bien y afuera no? Esa es una pregunta.
I think it's beautiful also what you say about this accepting differences, and also and connecting also what you were saying about in your experience all institutions end up in these bureaucratic processes, which for me are kind of zombie-like. They kind of work in their own logic without any more kind of life force or heart actually within them. I feel like this bureaucratic, I think of bureaucracies as these kind of weird zombie bodies, and I guess this is part of why I'm really interested in claiming that word and using the idea of what could an institution be? Is there a way of like experimenting with that format in and of itself? So for me, it's very, it's completely like it has this formal sounding name for a process that I see as like a lifelong project. I don't see it as there's a moment in which I arrive to that this is the institute and here is its founding location and its kind of founding mission. It seems to me that it's rather an engagement in a long-term, literally long project that has to do with gathering, hosting, sharing, and sort of exchanging forms of bodily practice. And perhaps inside of such an institution, the situation you present could happen. Like maybe we should try that, and then you can come to maybe we meet somewhere and actually try this, where we experiment with modes of sociability, and we see if this experimental idea of an institution, could it be one in which difference is not only tolerated, which is so what a limited, not generous way of thinking about difference, and actually be celebrated, where difference is actually necessary. Because if we look at microbiology and these things that I know that you're as well interested in, it's like diversity is life. You actually need difference for life at all, for flourishing of any kind. And I think that our bureaucratic structures tend to want to, in order for them to operate, they need to eliminate difference and standardize, right? That's what they were. And so could we imagine an institution where difference actually is the kind of best version, or it is the currency, let's say, of the situation.
Creo que tenemos.
Unfortunately, we have to finish.
Okay. Gracias.
Thank you so much.